I've followed very closely for many years and am incredibly fond of. So it gives me great pleasure to be here to welcome our guest today. The BBC National Short Story Award is now, unbelievably, in its 9th year, and I'm absolutely thrilled that we have the third all-female shortlist this year. I'd really like to welcome back Lionel Shriver, who mesmerised us all with prepositions last year, and Tessa Hadley, and to welcome Philip Gwyn-Jones and our chair for today, Di Spears. And what I just wanted to say was what an incredible impact I think Di has had on the BBC National Short Story Award, and I know she wouldn't say it, so I'd like to just take this opportunity to thank Di. She's definitely a Charleston insider and has worked wonders with this fantastic award. So Di, thank you very much indeed. Before I hand over to Di to take us through this afternoon, I'd also just like to take this opportunity to thank Lancing College for their support of this event. It's hugely appreciated. So without further ado, over to Di. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Lancing College. My husband's an old boy. You won't thank me for reminding him, I expect, but we didn't realise until we got here that you were sponsoring it, but that's very nice. Anyway, I'm delighted to be back here at Charleston, and we are celebrating another fantastic selection of stories this year. It's been a really strong list with very stellar names, as I'm sure you're all aware, people who've heard them on the air this week. We've had wonderful stories. Rose Tremaine, Zadie Smith, Francesca Riddoch, and also, obviously, Tessa Hadley, Lionel Shriver, who are joining me on the platform today. We're going to hear a little bit from Tessa's story and Lionel's story, and then we'll discuss the shortlist and the state of the short story at the moment. Very brief introductions. As you know, I'm sure, Tessa is a long-time crafter of short fiction. Her stories are published regularly in perhaps the most prestigious organ of short stories, I think, the New Yorker magazine. She's got 2 award-winning collections, Sunstroke and Married Love, as well as 5 novels. And she's also a professor of creative writing at Bath Spa, where she teaches people how to write the short story. And she is, last but not least, an ex-judge from this prize. She served on our committee in 2011. So I'm delighted that Tessa's here. Lionel, as Alistair said, shared this platform with me last year when she was shortlisted for her story about the day of 9/11, prepositions. And this is, in fact, the first time we've had somebody 3 times on the list, so we're really delighted that Lionel's on the list again and here to read for us again. Still, perhaps best known for We Need to Talk About Kevin and So Much for That. She's the author of 11 novels, but she is becoming, as I've said, a prolific short story writer now and a highly successful short story writer. So we look forward to more and more stories from her. And finally, Philip Gwyn-Jones joins me. He was one of our panel this year. He's a trustee of English Pen. He's a lecturer, teaches at Oxford Brookes now, and also an editor of Great Note and Acuity, formerly of Flamingo Press and Portobello, and now with Scribe. And he's somebody who's discovered a lot of short story writers, some very well known, like Jhumpa Lahiri. Also, short story writers that we've put regularly onto Radio 4, like Sana Krashkov and Gina Oshner, who are maybe not names that you know as well, but are definitely worth seeking out. He also discovered Eleanor Catton, who obviously doesn't write the short story, but the long one, but he's very good on the short stories. Anyway, I'd like to begin with letting you hear 2 passages from the 2 stories that we have, from the writers we have today. So Tessa is going to begin and introduce and read from her story, Bad Dreams.
Shall I get up?
I think lectern would be great, thanks.
My story is quite short. It all takes place in one night, and it's in 3 parts: a little girl's part, her mother's part, and then a sort of tiny third coda. So I'm just going to read the first part. A child woke up in the dark. She seemed to swim up into consciousness as if to a surface which she then broke through, looking around with her eyes open. At first, the darkness was implacable. She might have arrived anywhere. All that was certain was her own self, lying on her side, her salty smell and her warmth her knees pulled up to her skinny chest inside the cocoon of her brushed nylon nightdress. But as she stared into the darkness, familiar forms began to loom through it. The pale outline of a window printed by the street lamp against the curtains. The horizontals on the opposite wall, which were the shelves where she and her brother kept their books and toys. Beside the window, she could make out a rectangle of wool cloth tacked up. Her mother had appliqued onto it a sleigh and 2 horses and a driver cracking his whip, first gluing on the pieces and then outlining them with machine stitching, star shapes in blue thread for the falling snowflakes, lines of red stitching for the reins and the twisting whip. The child knew all these details off by heart, though she couldn't see them in the dark. She was where she always was when she woke up, in her own bedroom, in the top bunk, her younger brother asleep in the lower one. Her mother and her father must be in bed and asleep too. The basement flat was small enough that if they were awake, she would have heard the sewing machine or the wireless, or her father practicing the trumpet or playing jazz records. She struggled to sit up out of the tight wound nest of sheets and blankets. Cold night air struck her shoulders. It was strange to stare into the room with eyes wide open and feel the darkness yielding only the smallest bit, as if it were pressing back against her efforts to penetrate it. Something had happened, she was sure, while she was asleep. She didn't know at first what it was, but the strong dread it had left behind didn't subside with the confusion of waking. Then she remembered that this thing had happened inside her sleep, in her dream. She had dreamed something horrible, and so plausible that it was vividly present as soon as she remembered it. In the dream, she had been reading her favourite book, the one she read over and over and really had been reading earlier that same night until her mother came to turn off the light. In fact, she could feel the book's hard corner pressing into her leg now through the blankets. In the dream, she had been turning its pages as usual when, beyond the familiar last words, she found an extra section that she had never seen before, a short paragraph set on a page by itself headed Epilogue. She was an advanced reader for her age and knew about prologues and epilogues, though it didn't occur to her then that she was the author of her own dreams and must have invented this epilogue herself. It seemed so completely a found thing, alien and unanticipated, coming from outside herself against her will. In the real book she loved, Swallows and Amazons, 6 children spent their summers in perfect freedom, sailing dinghies on a lake, acting out adventures and rivalries that were half invented games and half truth. All the details in the book had the solidity of real life, though it wasn't her own real life. She didn't have servants or boats or a lake or an absent father in the Navy. She had read all the other books in the series too, and she acted out their stories with her friends at school, although they all lived in a city and none of them had ever been sailing. They had a Swallows and Amazons club and took turns bringing in grub to eat, grog and pemmican. They sewed badges and wrote notes in secret code. Now the girl seemed to see written on the darkness in front of her eyes the impersonal print of the dream epilogue. John and Roger both went on to, it began, in its business-like voice of sanity and reality. Of course, the print wasn't actually in front of her eyes, and parts of what was written were elusive when she sought them. Certain sentences, though, were scored into her awareness as sharply as if she'd heard them read aloud. Roger drowned at sea at a young age. Roger was the youngest of them all, the ship's boy, in whom she had only ever been mildly interested. This threw him into a terrible new prominence. The Blackett sisters, long illnesses, Titty killed in an unfortunate accident. The litany of deaths tore jaggedly into the tissue that the book had woven. making everything lopsided and hideous. The epilogue's gloating, bland language, complacently regretful, seemed to relish catching her out in her dismay. Oh, didn't you know? Susan lived to a ripe old age. Susan was the dullest of the swallows, tamed and sensible, in charge of cooking and housekeeping. Still, the idea of her ripe old age was full of horror. Wasn't she just a girl with everything ahead of her? The child knew that the epilogue was only a dream, but she couldn't dispel the taint of it clinging to her thoughts. When she was younger, she had called to her mother if she woke in the night and was frightened, but something stopped her from calling out now. She didn't want to tell anyone about her dream. Once the words were said aloud, she could never be rid of them. It was better to keep them hidden. For the first time, the child felt as if she were alone in her own home. She was aware intensely of its rooms spread out about her, invisible in the night, unlike their usual selves. The book touching her leg through the blankets frightened her, and she thought she might never be able to open it again. She swung over the side rail of the bed, feeling with her bare feet for the steps of the ladder, climbing past the lower bunk whose cave was so dark that she couldn't make out the shape of her sleeping brother, reaching until she felt the carpet's gritty wool under her toes. The children's bedroom and the bathroom and their parents' room were all at the front of the massive Victorian house, which was 4 stories tall, including this basement flat. Sometimes the child was aware of all those other rooms in the flats above, full of the furniture of other lives pressing down on their heads. Quietly, she opened her bedroom door. The doors to the kitchen and the lounge, which were at the back of the flat, stood open onto the windowless hallway. A thin blue light falling through them lay in rectangles on the hall carpet. Everything was tidy in the kitchen. The dishcloth had been wrung out and hung on the edge of the plastic washing-up bowl. Something on a plate was wrapped in greaseproof paper. The sewing machine was put away under its cover at one end of the table. The pieces of Liberty Lawn print, which her mother was cutting out for one of her ladies, were folded carefully in their paper bag to keep them clean. Liberty Lawn. Her mother named it reverently, like an incantation, though the daily business of her sewing wasn't reverent, but briskly pragmatic, cutting and pinning and snipping at seams with pinking shears, running the machine with her head bent close to the work in passionate bursts of concentration, one hand always raised to the wheel to slow it, breaking threads quickly in the little clip behind the needle. The chatter of the sewing machine, racing and easing and halting and starting up again, was like a busy engine driving their days. In the lounge, the child paddled her toes in the hair of the goatskin rug, gleaming white, uncanny, half reverted to its animal past. It yearned to the moon, which was balanced on top of the high wall at the back of their paved yard. The silver frame of her parents' wedding photograph and the yellow brass of her father's trumpet in its case with the lid open beside the music stand shone with the same pale light. Lifting the heavy lid of the gramophone, she breathed the forbidden smell of the records nestled in their compartments, then touched the pages heaped up on her father's desk. His meaning, densely tangled in his black italic writing, seemed more accessible through her fingertips in the dark than it ever was in daylight when its difficulty thwarted her. He was studying for his degree in the evenings after teaching in school all day. She and her brother played quietly so as not to disturb him. He was writing about a book, Leviathan. His ink bottle had left imprints on the desk's leather inlay, and he stored his notes on a shelf in cardboard folders carefully labelled, the pile of folders growing ever higher. And she was struck by the melancholy of this accumulation. Sometimes she felt a pang of fear for her father, as if he were exposed and vulnerable. She never feared in the same way for her mother. Her mother was capable. She was the whole world. The chairs in the lounge, looming formidably in the dimness, looked as if they had been drawn up for a spectacle, waiting more attentively than when they were filled with people. The angular recliner, built of tubular black steel with lozenges of polished wood for arms. The cone-shaped wicker chair in its round wrought iron frame. The black painted wooden armchair with orange cushions. The low divan covered in striped olive green cotton. This present moment, too, the one that enclosed her now as inevitably and tightly as skin, would one day become the past. Its details then would seem remarkable and poignant, and she would never be able to fit back inside them. The reality of the things in the room seemed more substantial to the child than she was herself. And she wanted in a sudden passion to break something, to disrupt this world of her home, sealed in its mysterious stillness where her bare feet made no sound on the lino or on the carpets. On impulse, using all her strength, she pushed at the recliner from behind, tipping it over slowly until it was upside down with its top resting on the carpet and its legs in the air, the rubber ferrules on the feet unexpectedly silly in the moonlight, like prim, tiny shoes. Then she tipped over the painted chair, too, so that its cushions flopped out. She pulled the wicker cone out of its frame and turned the frame over, flipped up the goatskin rug. She managed to make very little noise, just a few soft bumps and thuds. Yet when she had finished, the room looked as if a hurricane had blown through it, throwing the chairs about. She was shocked by what she'd effected, but gratified too, and she was breathing fast, her whole body rejoicing in the chaos. Perhaps it would be funny when her parents saw it in the morning. At any rate, nothing would ever make her tell them that she'd done it. They would never know, and that was funny too. Her private hilarity erupted in her, bubbling up inside her, though she wouldn't give way to it. She didn't want to make a sound. And at that very moment, as she surveyed her crazy handiwork, the moon sank below the top of the wall outside, and the room darkened, all its solidity withdrawn.
Thank you very much. That is, as Tessa said, the first section of that story, which will then go on and take another couple of perspectives, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But first, I'd like you to hear Lionel reading a part of her story.
Good afternoon. I'm afraid that in the introduction, it was underemphasized that I have not only been shortlisted twice before for this prize, but I have also lost twice. And I fear I may be in the process of assembling a matched set.
I also forgot to mention that Lionel has just flown in from New York this morning and has had no sleep, so it's fantastic.
I'm completely out of it.
Yes.
It's nice to have an excuse. Kalifi Creek is about a young woman named Liana. She's 22 when the story begins, who has gone abroad for the first time. She's from the United States, but she's taking a summer holiday in Kenya. And like a lot of people that age, is unthinking about the kind of impositions that she expects that she can take of strangers. So as the story commenced, she has just started staying with friends of friends of friends on the coast in the town of Kalifi. And it's an older couple. The woman, Regent, is a photographer, and her husband is a retired safari guide. And every day, Liana goes for a swim in Kalifi Creek to work up an appetite for the dinner that she expects them to prepare for her. So, as Liana sidled around the house in her bikini, gulping more passion fruit juice at the counter, grabbing a fresh towel. Her exhibitionism was unconscious. Call it instinctive, suggesting an inborn feel for barter. She lingered with Bino, inquiring about the biggest animal he'd ever shot, then commiserating about ivory poaching, always a crowd pleaser. As she bound back her long blonde hair, now bleached almost white, raised arms made her stomach look flatter. Turning with a cheerio that she picked up in Nairobi, Liana sashayed out the back porch and down the splintered wooden steps before cursing herself because she should have worn flip-flops. Returning for shoes would ruin her exit, so she picked her way carefully down the overgrown dirt track to the beach in bare feet. In Wisconsin, a creek was a shallow, burbling dribble with tadpoles that purled over rocks. Where Liana was from, you wouldn't go for a serious swim in a creek. You'd splash up to your ankles while cupping your arches over mossy stones, arms extended for balance, though you almost always fell in. But everything in Africa was bigger. Emptying into the Indian Ocean, Kilifi Creek was a river, an impressively wide river at that, which opened into a giant lake sort of thing when she swam to the left and under the bridge. This time, in the interest of variety, she would strike out to the right. The water was cold. Yipping at every advance, Liana struggled out to the depth of her upper thighs, gingerly avoiding sharp rocks. Regent and Bino may have referred to the shoreline as a beach, but there wasn't a grain of sand in sight, and with all the green gunk along the bank, obstacles were hard to spot. Chiding herself not to be a wimp, she plunged forward. This was a familiar ritual of her childhood trips to Lake Winnebago. The shriek of inhalation, the hyperventilation, the panic splashing to get the blood running, the soft surprise of how quickly the water feels warm. Liana considered herself a strong swimmer of a kind. That is, she'd never been comfortable with the gasping and thrashing of the crawl, which felt frenetic. But she was a virtuoso of the side stroke, with a powerful scissor kick whose thrust carried her faster than many swimmers with inefficient crawls, much to their annoyance, as she'd verified in her college pool. The side stroke was contemplative. Its rhythm was ideally calibrated for a breath on every other kick, and resting only one cheek in the water allowed her to look around. It was less rigorous than the butterfly, but not as geriatric as the breaststroke, and after long enough you still got tired. Marvelously so. Pulling out far enough from the riverbank so that she shouldn't have to worry about hitting rocks with that scissor kick, Liana rounded to the right and rapidly hit her stride. The late afternoon light had just begun to mellow. The shores were forested, with richly shaded inlets and copses. She didn't know the names of the trees, but now that she was alone, with no one trying to make her feel ignorant about a continent of which white people tended to be curiously possessive, she didn't care if those were acacias or junipers. They were green. Good enough. Though Kilifi was renowned as a resort area for high-end tourists and secreted any number of capacious houses like her hosts, the canopy hid them well. It looked like wilderness. Good enough. Gloriously, Liana didn't have to watch out for the power boats and jet skis that terrorized Lake Winnebago, and she was the only swimmer in sight. Africans, she'd been told, didn't swim. Lord, how much she'd been told. Every backpacker 3 days out of Jomo Kenyatta Airport was an expert. Not only was the affluent safari set too lazy to get into the water, but by this late in the afternoon, they were already drunk. This was the best part of the day. No more enthusiastic chatter about Regent's latest work. For heaven's sake, You'd think she might have finally discovered color photography at this late date. Blazing with yellow flora, red earth, and, at least outside Nairobi, unsullied azure sky, Africa was wasted on the woman. All she photographed was dust and poor people. It was a relief, too, not to have to seem fascinated as Bino lamented the unsustainable growth of human population and the demise of Kenyan game, all the while pretending she hadn't heard variations on this same dirge dozens of times in a mere 3 weeks. Though she did hope that before she hopped a ride back to Nairobi with Ponytail Guy, the couple would opt for a repeat of that antelope steak from the first night. The meat had been lean. Rare in both senses of the word, it gave good text the next morning. There wasn't much point in going all the way to Africa and then sitting around eating another hamburger. Liana paused her reverie to check her position. And sure enough, she drifted farther from the shore than was probably wise. She knew from the lake swims of her childhood that distance over water was hard to judge. If anything, the shore was farther away than it looked. So she pulled heavily to the right and was struck by how long it took to make the trees appear appreciably larger. Just when she'd determined that land was within safe reach, she gave one more stiff kick and her right foot struck rock. The pain was sharp. Liana hated interrupting a swim and didn't have much time before the equatorial sunset, as if someone had flicked a light switch. Nevertheless, she dropped her feet and discovered that this section of the creek was barely a foot and a half deep. No wonder she'd hit a rock. Sloshing to a sun-warmed outcrop, she examined the top of her foot, which began to gush blood as soon as she lifted it out of the water. There was a flap. Something of a mess. Even if she headed straight back to the Henleys, all she could see was thicket, no path, much less a road. The only way to return and put some kind of dressing on this stupid thing was to swim. As she stumbled through the shallows, her foot smarted. Yet, bathed in the cool water, it quickly grew numb. Once she had slogged in deep enough to resume her side stroke, Liana reasoned, "Big deal, I cut my foot." The water would keep the laceration clean, the chill would stanch the bleeding. It didn't really hurt much now, and the only decision was whether to cut the swim short. The silence pierced by tropical bird calls was a relief, and Liana didn't feel like showing up back at the house with too much time to kill with enraptured blah-blah before dinner. She'd promised herself that she'd swim at least a mile, and she couldn't have done more than a quarter. So Liana continued to the right, making damn sure to swim out far enough so that she was in no danger of hitting another rock. Still, the cut had left her rattled. Her idyll had been violated. No longer gentle and welcoming, the shoreline shadows undulated with a hint of menace. The creek had bitten her. Having grown fitful, the side stroke had transformed from luxury to chore. Possibly she'd tightened up from a queer, encroaching fearfulness. Or perhaps she was suffering from a trace of shock. Unless, that is, the water had genuinely got colder. Once in a while she felt a flitter against her foot, like a fish. But it wasn't a fish. It was the flap. Kind of creepy. Liana resigned herself. This expedition was no longer fun. The light had taken a turn from golden to vermilion, a modulation she'd have found transfixing if only she were on dry land. And she still had to swim all the way back. Churning a short length farther to satisfy pride, she turned around. And got nowhere. Stroking at full power, Liana could swear she was going backward. As long as she'd been swimming roughly in the same direction, the current hadn't been noticeable. This was a creek, right? But an African creek. As for her having failed to detect the violent surge running at a 45-degree angle to the shoreline, an aphorism must have applied. Something about never being aware of forces that are on your side until you defy them. Liana made another assessment of her position. Her best guess was that the shore had drifted farther away again. Very much farther. The current had been pulling her out, which she'd been dithering about the fish flutter flap of her foot, which was now the least of her problems, because the shore was not only distant, it stopped. Beyond the end of the land was nothing but water, Indian Ocean water. If she did not get out of the grip of the current, it would sweep her past that last little nub of the continent and out to sea. Suddenly the dearth of boats, jet skis, fellow swimmers, and visible residents or tourists, drunken or not, seemed far less glorious. The sensation that descended was calm, determined, and quiet, though it was underwritten by a suppressed hysteria that it was not in her interest to indulge. Had she concentration to spare, she might have worked out that this whole emotional package was one of her first true tastes of adulthood. What happens when you realize that a great deal or even everything is at stake and that no one is going to help you? It was a feeling that some children probably did experience, but shouldn't. At least solitude discouraged theatrics. She had no audience to panic for, no one to exclaim to, no one to whom she might bemoan her quandary. It was all do, no say. Swimming directly against the current had proved fruitless. Instead, Liana angled sharply toward the shore so that she was cutting across the current, though she was still pointed backward in the direction of Regent and Bino's place. This riptide would keep dragging her body to the left. Had she known her exact speed, in the exact rate at which the current was carrying her in the direction of the Indian Ocean, she would have been able to answer the question of whether she was about to die by solving a simple geometry problem. A point travels at a set speed, at a set angle, toward a plane of a set width, while moving at a set speed to the left. Either it will intersect the plane, or it will miss the plane and keep traveling into wide open space. Liquid space, in this case. Of course, she wasn't in possession of these variables, so she swam as hard and as steadily as she knew how. There was little likelihood that suddenly adopting the crawl, at which she'd never been any good, would improve her chances, so the side stroke it would remain. She trained her eyes on a distinctive rock formation as a navigational guide. Thinking about her foot wouldn't help, so she did not. Thinking about how exhausted she was wouldn't help, so she did not. Thinking about never having been all that proficient at geometry was hardly an assist either, so she proceeded in a state of dumb animal optimism. The last of the sun glinted through the trees and winked out. Technically, the residual threads of pink and gray in the early evening sky were very pretty.
And you will have to read the story to find out, obviously, whether she survives. Thank you both very much indeed. Both these stories, and in fact I think arguably all 5 of the stories this year in our shortlist, are very much about those moments where a penny drops or people reach a new level of understanding. It happens with the child in your story. The adult world becomes something slightly more in focus for her. It certainly happens with Liana's sudden understanding of her mortality, something she's not encountered or even considered up to that point. And I wondered if for both of you, though, that kind of moment of recognition is something you consciously use and think is a very useful tool if you're writing a short story. Is it where you begin often?
I think maybe you tend to begin with the moment of something happening. And then, of course, what is interesting about something happening is what it then produces in terms of consciousness, what it does to add to thought and imagination and one's sense of context, like your girl awakening to that essential aloneness. But I think the stories, for me, starts with something happening.
Yeah.
I think I'm especially interested in epiphanies that we keep having over and over again. So, and this particular kind of epiphany is typical. We don't have this single moment in our lives that we realize that sometime we're going to die. It happens over and over, and we never quite get it. So this is probably the first point in my character's life that she has come this close to dying, but it won't be the last, and that is a lot of what this story is about. And I think one of the things that's interesting about the nature of epiphanies is that they are not permanent. They don't last, and it's one of the things that makes them so frustrating, so that we're constantly learning the same lesson over and over again. But in the case of this story, I was particularly interested in this little trove of experiences that I think most of us carry, the times we almost died. And what do you make of those moments? And they're often in very unstriking instances. It's not just, you're in this dramatic setting off the coast of Africa. It's also stepping off a curb in London and not noticing there's a bus coming. And you don't even tell these stories because they're not stories. They're about what didn't happen. But if it's close enough, it makes a huge impact on you.
But actually, one of the things, we didn't quite reach that point, but one of the things Liana decides to do, having been very happy to talk about herself throughout her expedition through Africa and seeing herself as this gift to everybody that she stays with, is actually this moment of increasing adulthood in this story is an understanding that actually there are things you also keep private, and it's the same for your child, that these are things that as you understand more, you decide, I won't share this with everybody, which in a way is a strange thing then to decide that that's what you write a story about, I think.
Because then you're sharing it, or the writer is sharing your experience vicariously with an audience of readers. So that's funny, yes, the double impulse of something that needs to be kept secret, and yet its function in the story is to reach out and be a story. That's quite an interesting idea.
And it makes it good drama, doesn't it? I think, if you do. Is it something that you like when you're reading stories, to see epiphanies, and do you agree with Lionel that they actually, the more interesting ones are the ones that people don't really take fully on board?
People not learning, as it were, repeatedly over and over. In Zadie Smith's story, it's also about learning. You might say learning, not so much about death necessarily, but about aging and failing to learn some of the truths that have been blaring out from speakers all around you, but you haven't taken them in. And she finally, Miss Adele, the main character, has a pivot moment where everything suddenly kind of falls around her. And then at the other end of the scale, in Francesca's story, you also have a younger girl learning about the realities of male behavior, family dynamics, and her sexuality, and the value of secrets, and what other people do with their secrets, and sort of seeing the effect of secrets in her own life and that of her parents, particularly in that story. So yes, there are commonalities, aren't there, across all 5 roses too.
One doesn't want the epiphany to be moralising, though. That's just the danger of talking about epiphanies. It sounds as if you learn a letter, though that was explicit what you were saying we don't do, And there is no lesson anyway to be learned from knowing you're going to die.
Well,
Is there?
that's just it. I mean, that's what toward the end of the story that what this rounds on, because okay, fine, she makes it. But she looks back on that, and she knows that the cheap thing to do would be to say, "Oh, I should never go swimming by myself." You know, that kind of. That's not moralizing exactly, but
Yeah.
improving. You know, I was foolish, and she realizes that is to diminish the scale of the lesson.
Yes.
It's bigger and cruder than that.
Yeah.
And she refuses to put that on that. And I think we tend to take those mortality moments and we shrink them by saying, well, you know, I've got to look both ways before I cross the street. That's not what it was about.
No. Yeah, that's right.
And for your little girl turning the furniture over and saying that she will never tell her parents, I mean, what you then see as the story unfolds is the mother's reaction to it, which is completely different. And this was born out of something that you did yourself, I believe.
Strangely, I did once throw the furniture around quietly at night in my parents' flat. The rest of it is not autobiographical, but that is a real thing. Yeah, the bit about what happens next is that act, which she's going to keep quiet about and doesn't really think any more of in a way, is picked up by her mother as meaning something completely different. Her mother doesn't occur to her daughter will have done this thing, so the mother makes a new story out of it. So that's not very moral, is it? Because the cause and effect of an action and its consequences are a little bit random and scary in that the mother is reading it wrong. And yet it will have consequences, but they're not properly logical, learning, wise, wisdom-increasing consequences. They're sort of slightly arbitrary consequences. But again, that's really deliciously interesting for a story.
Yes.
Yeah, I also like the idea that the epiphany is not necessarily improving. That is, at least in my story, one of the things that the girl learns, and to her great disappointment, is that maturity can involve getting smaller. There's a loss, that loss of innocence, that I actually I admire youthful heedlessness. I think it has a beauty. It's maybe stupid, but it makes possible things that later are not. And I saw a package recently on these extreme sportsmen, almost all of whom were under 25, in Utah, who were, leaping off cliffs and, walking down tight ropes over canyons, and it's beautiful, and I couldn't do it, and later they won't be able to either.
But actually, the real beauty in your story is that you're given that package of youthful, joyous, expansive heedlessness, and then we see the moment of it being constrained. And although humanly for her, that's a diminishment in the story because it has some huge resonance. That's really beautiful, actually. That's a contradiction in fiction, isn't it? That the very thing which is diminishing and almost mean becomes lovely.
Well,
as
we
in
think
art.
she's getting wiser. She feels lesser. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, there is also, I think there's something of your mourning of that invincibility, which I thought was another facet of the story, which I also really
Yeah.
liked. 'Cause I think people disagree about how arrogant or not she is, but I think actually it's a great example of youth. As your child, to me, seemed to be very like an awful lot of girls who get swept up in books and become can over-dramatize it to themselves. But it's very plausible, I think, her reaction, as is the mother's when you misread a situation. I was interested in the fact that your short story, although obviously her understanding and also what it presages means that it's much more than the few hours that it takes place in. It is a very tightly drawn story. We start in the middle of the night and it's over by the morning. You're quite happy to sort of take the risk and play with the decade or more of Liana's life. In fact, you will bring her on into her 30s. And I suppose what it says is that there are no rules, really. There may be conventions, but are there no rules about what you can do with time and space in short stories?
Funnily enough, I think we actually do pretty much the same thing, because the very last tiny section of mine, while it is apparently the next morning, it sort of feels
It's
like
a drawback,
long
isn't it?
shot
Yes.
from
Yes,
the
it is.
teacher.
Yes, you feel
And
the
it's for
camera
the,
pulling back.
it's for the reader.
Exactly
It's,
what happens
you're
when you-
outside the
yes,
family,
you
aren't
are. You are. So
And
it's
I thought the
yeah.
arc of the future just
Yeah,
did
yeah.
me.
And I think that's maybe, I'm not sure the short story has always done that, but that's something maybe it has, but maybe that's inevitable. What you have is an intense chunk or bite of the present, which then, in the place of what a novel has, which is extension and cumulative power, it then makes that long gesture to the long reach, and that kind of embeds the intensity in a bigger scale.
Yeah.
and it allows you to throw right back into the past, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, there are tiny moments, there are things when she's looking around the room which will give you the entire last 10 years for
Yeah.
her, in small moments.
Both stories, although they have different spans, as you're saying, in time, they have the same tautness, and I think all great stories have a kind of tautness, and the difference between that and novel writing is that a great storyteller in short story form can hold that tautness, whatever the means, whatever. In Zadie's, it's a monologue, it's one character performing and realizing that, her time on the stage is over. And that's a very different approach to either of yours, but it's still something that's held perfectly taut for the duration of the story. Whereas in a novel, you can't do that. You can't ask that of a reader, and no novelist can really deliver it. It would be draining. It would be exhausting for all concerned, reader and writer both. And yet in a story you can and do. And I think the best always have that perfect tension, whether it's taking place in such a short span or actually over a lifetime.
And when you're both of you write novels as well. Is it, this is a question that's often asked, but is it very clear to you that you can encapsulate everything you're trying to say within that, within a moment where you can throw back and forward, but you can do it in a very few words?
Do you mean when you think?
Well,
of
I
a
mean, when you're
story, do
starting,
you know whether
when you
it's
start, how clear are you that it will be a story, that it's not a novel, that it isn't part of something, that this character, because Liana could have had any time, we didn't need it because it worked so economically and it was so taut, but did you
I think-
toy with making her into a longer novel?
No, I didn't. I mean, I think, you recognize,
it's a short story.
it's like you're either introduced to a 2-year-old or a grown-up, and you can tell the difference.
Have you ever started something you thought was a novel and then pruned it down and down?
No,
and
I
down?
think it would more likely go the other direction. I have
Yeah.
started, the one thing I have done once is to write a short story, and then it turned into a novella. And I can see how that can happen.
You have built on characters though, haven't you, I think, in yours?
Well, what I've done is write a short story and then write another short story about the same people a little further along, and then another, that's something you can do, and
Yes.
that builds a particular kind of novel. And I think actually when I wrote the first story of my last novel was sort of episodic, and I did write that first chapter. But it wasn't like I had that one idea and it was that shape and then I thought it could be that long. The first chapter is still story-shaped, and then I thought there could be another and another and another. So then you get a sort of particular kind of episodic structure to the novel.
Yes. And I know that when you're teaching, you always say to your students, don't write about dreams, and you did write about it. Going back to this idea about whether there are any rules to follow, do you think there are rules then?
Of course there aren't any rules, no. But you just have to have good reasons for breaking the conventions. They're not rules, but just watch out for the things that are likely to write badly, and then if you feel confident enough that you're going to get away with it. So I did say no dreams, because they're usually tedious, and no crying, because students write crying all the time. It's very strange. I think they are so excited to be releasing themselves in fiction that some great emotional surge comes to the fore, and there's tears and
But you
tears.
can moo.
Oh, yes.
Emotional search and behind.
Yes. Actually, one of the impressive things about Liana is she doesn't cry or indeed move. She just gets on with it and doesn't
Yeah,
panic.
I know. That's really.
I think that's one of her
admirable.
great
I like
strengths.
it. Yeah.
And I've been talking more widely about the stories that we saw this year, Philip. I mean, there were some, clearly absolutely outstanding ones, which are the ones that are our shortlist. But I wondered what you felt about the sort of the trends and the subject matter that was coming. I don't remember a lot of tears, actually. were there? I don't remember
No.
many with weeping
Rejected
students in them.
always.
Maybe they hadn't
Not
even
much
made it.
tears.
There were 550 entries, but I don't remember a lot of tears.
Not much tears.
But,
not much laughter either, you might
No.
I mean, we've talked about this
Yes.
before.
So our perennial call, humour.
All of the judges felt it was quite notable that there weren't many writers attempting comedy in any sort of straightforward way. I mean, yes, there are, all of these stories have their moments of comedy.
And we now have more.
Yes, we have a backdrop of comedy. But no, there were no attempts at comic writing. There were few attempts, weren't there, at genre writing in story form. There was very little sci-fi, and what there was somewhat ham-fisted, somewhat sort of cliched. There were a few other kind of
Very little experimental
That too.
attempts, I think,
Yeah.
with text, which is interesting because there is quite a lot going on, you know, in terms of whether it's people writing stories on Twitter, like David Mitchell's probably the most famous exponent at the moment, but there's quite a lot of interest in that. I don't know if you're seeing that with your students, Tessa.
Experimental, probably not that much. Again, once every so often a student comes along who wants to do something like that. Genre, much more. I mean, I suspect people read the short story competition and think this isn't what they're looking for, and there are
Probably
probably
so.
lots of short story sci-fi prizes, I suspect, that they will put in.
They would put in for, yes. But I know, I think there was certainly a lack this year, I think, we thought of people.
There were people
Stepping
playing
beyond
with
convention.
language, but there weren't people playing with form. I mean, there were lots of lots of great writing, endeavouring to get at the heart of what is going on today, in one way or another. But there wasn't much dealing with the structure or the form of the story itself. No, that was notable. It was. I wonder if there's some kind of return to realism in Train.
I mean, there's certainly a great sense at the moment that the short story has, a fantastic place on the literary stage, I think. I mean, this year has been an amazing year with Alice Munro and the Nobel, and George Saunders winning the first Folio Award, going to a collection of short stories, which I think was a surprise to people, but rather wonderful. The International Foreign Fiction Prize went to Hassan Blassim as well. So it feels to me as if it's quite a healthy climate. Do you think, as someone who's involved in publishing, that there's more interest in it? Are people publishing more collections now?
I think publishers will always defy the odds and the reality that, unfortunately, it has seemed over the last 10, 20 years that short stories, despite all the sort of social changes, structural changes that ought to make them so central, yet they still don't seem to appeal in collection form as readily as a new novel. So a new voice from a story collection, a new story writer, as opposed to a new novelist. The publisher will always back the novelist much harder. And you're going back to what Tess was saying. Publishers love turning collections of stories into a novel in stories. That's the phrase, because they feel they can get that much further, and that's really about readers and what they want. But yes, it's undeniable that this last year in particular has seen story writing elevated to the art form it is, and it is a different art form. I mean, I think that's for a long time it was perhaps seen as a sort of a younger, weaker sibling to the novel, and it is emphatically not that. It's a different art form. Those of us who've always published stories have banged on about that for years, and maybe yes, commercially the time is now right for it to be something even more saleable.
It would be really lovely if there were some equivalent in Britain to the New Yorker, which published a story every week. There are lots of weekly, classy, cultural, Sunday magazines and things. Wouldn't that be nice?
It would be. They used to.
There are, of course, I have to say here, stories on radio.
Yep.
I know. Thank God for the radio.
Di keeps it all
Yes,
alive.
which I do try and keep going.
outlet.
And actually, I should mention here, because you're a captive audience, that you should look out for the new page on the BBC Arts page. There's a special page dedicated to the short story at the moment, partly celebrating the Short Story Award, but also with 10 stories, including William Trevor reading his own work, and a wonderful story by Alice Munro and Marina Warner's story. There's 10 rather lovely gems from the recent archive, which we've cleared the rights for and which are there in perpetuity. So if you go to BBC Arts, you can find those and listen to them, and they're great to enjoy. I'm aware that time is passing on, and I'm sure there are questions.
They also need to download these 5 stories while they still
Well, you
can,
still
right? Because you
can,
only
yes.
have about a few days to do so. And they're all brilliantly read. They were broadcast
obviously,
this week.
Please buy the collection too.
So iPlayer for 10 minutes later, please,
yes.
everybody.
Yes, and listen out, of course, to see who's going to be awarded the final accolade. I always feel with this award, though, that our 5 stories and our 5 shortlisted writers are equally important. They get equal prominence on air, and although, of course, in the end, there has to be, as they say, a winner, it's a fantastically strong list, and as always, a pleasure to read all 5, and they're complementary. But I'm aware that there might be questions, and we'll probably see Diana nodding at me, so I don't know if we can bring the lights up at all. Can't see anything. Whether anybody would like to ask anybody on the panel anything. Can't actually see. Do you want to wait for a mic to come? Sorry.
Not a question, Lionel. I love the story. I heard the whole thing on the radio, actually, so I know what happened. But
Right.
I was worried about the crocodiles. I grew up in Africa.
Well, I've been to Khalifi Creek, and I was not warned, but I don't think there were any, unless the people I was staying with didn't like me.
They're really surprised when you came back.
True. Yes. Can't see. There's somebody up there with their hand up at the back there on the left-hand side.
Thank you. In both stories, with the kind of unobserved moments, epiphanies of these characters in isolation, but the voice of the writer in describing those was really striking. How close you were to the character in the way that you were telling the story, and I wondered how quickly your perspective in the writing of those moments came, or whether that was something you had to work on to get that.
I don't know, if you're telling a story, you naturally identify with the person to whom it is happening. So, no, I don't experience that as an effort. Maybe there are detached ways of telling stories, which is more repertorial in approach and clinical, and that's not what I'm doing here. I'm using a third person limited, so it's from someone's perspective and in their head, and that
No,
creates a
you know
certain intimacy.
You know some things she doesn't know. You do that calculation.
Oh, yes.
about the
Actually,
angles.
one of the things that's interesting about the tone of the story, you get less of it in the part that I read, but I construct a little distance between the character and the narrator. And it's meant to express the difference between the older self and the younger self, so that we achieve a little bit of that clinical relationship to our own pasts and our own former selves. And I would criticize myself when I was in my 20s for the number of older adults I imposed upon, expecting them to give me clean sheets and clean towels and dinner. And these were people that I barely knew. What was wrong with me? And that's the distance.
Yeah.
And presumably now youngsters come to you and impose themselves
You
on
say
you.
no
and-
if you've
Did
got
I tell them to fuck off?
I would say though in Tessa's story though, 'cause when you jump from, because you're very in the child's head, and that feels very true. But that's a very cleverly constructed, technically difficult thing that you do in the story, because you then you move to the mother's perspective, and then we come to this longer shot, if you like, the sort of the distant view of the reader, and the reader understands things that the mother won't understand, and the child certainly.
The
won't
reader is the
understand.
only one who knows both
Bits,
halves of the story,
yes.
of course, or the
And-
writer is the only one. with
And
the
that
reader.
must have been technically quite difficult, wasn't it?
Well,
Or-
except of course, like Lionel, when
It
you're
just happened.
doing it, you don't think, oh, what's
This is
what's the
technically
end?
difficult.
This is technically difficult. It occurs to you in a piece, the narrative voice and the positioning, which you're absolutely right, is really important and really significant in both of those stories. But it comes first. The story isn't imaginable without that positioning. And I think, I do think, having taught lots of writing students, it is worth being very wary of getting really trapped inside a very close either first person or even a close third person, where you're not allowed to comment or have that lovely wriggle room of having a long view and watching your character do things. So kind of, it's so liberating. It's almost as if, you know, we got very embarrassed about omniscient authors in the 19th century novel. There was a sort of fashion for finding that very uncomfortable. But actually, for goodness sake, you're making the story up. You can just do what you want with it. And to make yourself, as the storyteller, be able to deploy all of the things you have to say and want to see without being very constricted by thinking, oh, would she have seen that? Would she have thought that? Would she have used that language? Is tremendously freeing and exciting.
And do you think as an editor you have to intervene sometimes if you see that's going wrong?
Well, you
How,
want...
how far can you? Because actually, in a way, it's an author's vision.
Well, of course, and a good editor is only ever trying to get an author who might have strayed from that vision temporarily back to it, and pointing out the odd inconsistency in the vision. And you know, if you are in a tight narrative or a tight perspective, they need to be reminded of that sometimes. But yes, the more liberated, freeing one is easier to play with. There's more wiggle room. But no, all you're doing is helping them get back to where they wanted to be in the first place.
And in fact, I'm just reading Colm Tóibín's new marvellous novel, in which there's not an inch of straying. There's no explicatory voice or commentating voice at all. So there are no rules. There are no rules. There's just what the book needs.
No. Can't see if there's any other questions. There's one here over on the... Sorry, it's like staring into a...
It's rather murky out there.
Sorry, I'm afraid this is another technical difficulties question. Lionel, you write beautifully about ennui, and I just can't imagine how tricky that must be. And I wondered if you had any insights that you could share on how you do that.
Okay, maybe I'm underslept, but I think I failed to catch the most important word.
Oh, boredom.
About boredom.
Yeah, it's people who are bored. And,
I never thought about that. Do I?
Well, in this story, she's describing how bored she is of all of these stories that she's been told already about,
Right.
Africa.
Well, I would say that in this instance, that is it's an affectation. That especially young people and travelers of all sort are in a rush to become savvy. And one of the things that you want to claim in order to appear savvy is to be bored already, right? You've seen it all. You've got it all already. And actually, there's a little passage in the New Republic that addresses itself to precisely this phenomenon and the irony of going on adventures only to rush to find them tedious. It's insensible. And I guess more notoriously, I did write about boredom in Kevin, and it was about boredom with motherhood and boredom with your own little kid. And I think that speaks to the fact that, not being a mother myself, I have always been gobsmacked that adults can stand to be around small children for more than about 5 minutes and sing the alphabet song over and over again. So I thought that writing about motherhood, I had to address myself to boredom, and of course the trick to writing about boredom is that you have to be interesting in the actual text. You can't be boring. So I guess that's the tricky part.
technical.
Technical difficulty.
Thank you all very, very much indeed to my panel today, to Tessa Hadley, Philip Wynne-Jones, Lionel Shriver. Thank you all for the audience. Do read the stories, listen to them online, listen to Front Row, which will have a great celebration of the short story. There'll be the award. There's also an interview with Hilary Mantel on her new collection on Tuesday night at 7:15. And thank you very much for coming.
Well, I'm sure you'll all agree that we certainly weren't bored for 1 second. I could have stayed all afternoon listening to a fantastic debate. My sincere thanks again to authors Lionel Shriver and Tessa Hadley. Fantastic to have you both here, and I hope you'll be back with us again soon. My thanks to Philip for his insider tips from a publisher's perspective, and of course to BBC Books editor Di Spears for her masterful chairing. And as Di has already alluded, if you'd like to find much, much more, then do go to the new BBC Arts online pages that I know Di has been deeply instrumental in bringing together. Both of our authors are going to be signing in the bookshop in a moment, but I'd be hugely grateful if you, as ever, would stay seated for a moment while I take them to the bookshop, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. So thank you again.